Hey everybody, this is Tony Jones, and on behalf of BeliefNet and my blog called The New Christians at BeliefNet, I'm really happy to interview Bart Ehrman. Bart.
Hello.
You there?
Yes, I am.
Hey, all right. Well, Bart, I just have read your new book, Jesus Interrupted, and you've been, I'm sure, doing massive amounts of media. So for you to deign to talk to a lowly blogger, I'm appreciative. But tell me, I'm a Princeton guy too, and I've a few years behind you in the PhD at Princeton. But it seems like a lot of your kind of what you've written about, especially in your books that have been big sellers recently, emerged from your time at Princeton. And you've written a lot about that, but are there things that as you look back on Princeton that you uncover that you think were that's particularly significant in kind of changing your view of the Bible?
Yeah, I went to Princeton Seminary really for just one reason. I had gone to Wheaton College and had taken Greek there and enjoyed Greek and was pretty good at it, and wanted to do a PhD eventually dealing with the Greek New Testament. But specifically, I was interested in working in textual criticism, working with the Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. And, of course, Bruce Metzger taught at Princeton Theological Seminary. So I applied to Princeton for one purpose only, which was to study with Bruce Metzger. And in part, it was because I thought that this would be a safe way for an evangelical like me to get a solid degree in New Testament studies was by doing textual criticism, because I wouldn't have to deal with theological issues at a school that disagreed with my theology. And so
did you go in thinking that straight kind of study of the manuscript was less ideologically driven than a study of like systematic theology, for instance?
Absolutely. In fact, the field of textual criticism is peopled with scholars like that who have gone off to do degrees at reputable schools but worked in text criticism so they didn't have to deal with theology and didn't have to deal with biblical criticism or we're going to work with manuscripts, which always seems to people to be the safe way to go.
When I was at Princeton, we would kind of joke. I'm in practical theology, so we spend a lot of time talking about hermeneutics, and you have to take a seminar on hermeneutics, and you have to take a comprehensive exam in hermeneutics. And we would always kind of joke about how much we talked about interpretation, and then our dissertations are rife with hermeneutics, but that the people in Old Testament and New Testament were more like mathematicians, that they were talking about how many times can you find the second aorist when it, in its particular permutation or something like that, and I'll write my dissertation on, uses of the second aorist in Luke Acts or something like that.
Well, it is a striking thing that people in biblical studies tend not to take courses in hermeneutics. On any level. They take courses in exegesis, which, of course, in some evangelical circles, those are the same thing. But,
right.
But the idea of philosophical hermeneutics simply isn't part of the curriculum for most people working in biblical studies. But in my case, that didn't end up mattering, because I think that if I had taken courses in hermeneutics, my barrier would have been so strong that nothing would have gotten through it. And so what happened to me was that I took courses in biblical studies that were of what you're calling sort of the mathematical sort, but they had the effect of breaking through my assumptions about the Bible that I brought in with me, that the Bible was some kind of infallible guide without any mistakes in it. So the way you break through that isn't by reading Ricoeur. The way or Derrida or Foucault or whatever. I mean, the way you break through that is by doing hardcore modernist historical criticism.
So do you think you'd come from Moody. It's funny, I asked commenters on my blog if they had any questions for you, and I got a couple that I'll get to in a few minutes. But one of them was a student from Moody who said, Bart, your writings are making a lot more sense to me than what I'm learning at Moody. I'm a second semester senior. How can I possibly finish and graduate from this place?
Wow.
I don't know that you'd have any good advice for that person, but
well, yeah. I mean, my advice is that you graduate and then get on with your life.
Right. I mean, I don't, not to belabor the point, but do you think in biblical studies there's a bit, and this shows my bias as in practical theology, but do you think there's a bit of a naivete about philosophical hermeneutics?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, the way biblical studies is typically taught is completely based on 19th century assumptions about text and meaning. So there is this kind of assumption that texts will yield their meaning to you if you simply approach them in the proper exegetical fashion, and so it's all about finding the meaning in the text. And so modern theory, critical theory, literary theory, has left a lot of biblical studies completely untouched. So the deal is, though, I don't get into that kind of thing so much in my books because
right.
of the audience that I'm dealing with. I'm dealing with an audience that believes in objectivity and that believes that texts yield their meaning. And my goal is to help people see that view is problematic, but the way to get to those people, again, isn't by trying to get them to read Foucault, because they're not going to understand Foucault, or if they do understand it, they're not going to appreciate Foucault. What they're going to appreciate is when you point out, in fact, taking their own assumptions, this text is problematic, based on their own assumptions about the text.
It's interesting. I think probably some people who are listening to this will bristle when they hear you say that your quest in writing is to help people, quote unquote, because they're going to see you as some nefarious figure who's trying to destroy the authority of the sacred text.
Right. Well, that's not true at all, actually. I mean, it's true that I'm trying to get people to see that the Bible cannot be an inerrant revelation from God. It can't be. There are too many discrepancies and contradictions and different perspectives. There are books in the New Testament that claim to be written by people who didn't write them, and so there are all these problems. But this shouldn't destroy somebody's faith. The last chapter of my book is called of Jesus Interrupted is called "Is Faith Possible?" And I answer very strongly, yes, it's possible, but certain kinds of faith simply aren't tenable in my view. And leaving behind that kind of faith that's not tenable is a good thing. It's not a bad thing.
Well, let me ask you. I mean, you think that a lot of people, and I agree with you, and I think it's a very unhappy situation in American Christianity. And I think it's really an unhappy situation in Christianity in the global South, which is, increasingly conservative and literalistic. But aren't you appealing in your book to kind of this logical positivist kind of paradigm that kind of, you know what I'm saying? Like
Yes, no, I know exactly what you're saying, and what I'm trying to do is, I guess I'm fighting fire with fire, because of the way that I myself came to realize that the Bible cannot be some kind of objective revelation from God that is inerrant. The way I came to that realization was not by reading philosophical hermeneutics. The way I came to that realization was by having a certain set of assumptions about objectivity and truth and the law of non-contradiction and so forth, and seeing that, in fact, the Bible does have problems. On those very assumptions, the Bible has problems, which forced me to a different philosophical perspective. But I couldn't have gotten to that philosophical perspective through reading the philosophers or the theorists.
Okay.
If that makes sense, if you see what I'm saying.
It does. It does. And I just wonder, so in your books, you don't really, I guess then you don't really show your cards on your chosen hermeneutical position at this point, because you're still arguing to people who are objectivists. So you're saying you're trying to speak the language of objectivists to objectivists to kind of deconstruct how they understand the Bible.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying actually to reach people, and you have to reach people where they are. You can't reach them by hoping that they'll be where you are. And so I think you have to go to where people are, and this is where people are.
For sure.
I think there's a long tradition of this within Christianity. I mean, I've done a lot of work on the Church Father Origen, who has precisely this idea that you reach people where they are, and you bring them along, but you can't expect them to take gigantic leaps. And so Origen had this very sophisticated spiritual hermeneutic when he approached texts, but he started out with a literal interpretation of a text to get him there. And so I kind of see it that way, that it's a pedagogical project that requires you starting out where people are.
And what do you think is the danger? I mean, you're trying to help people, and sometimes gently, sometimes not so gently, deconstruct their kind of objectivist, literalist readings of text, and to help them toward what end? I mean, do you see? Obviously, I personally agree that it's better if people have a less naive reading of the Bible or of any text, but particularly of the Bible. But what's the danger of the objectivist reading? What's the danger in what you learned when you were at Moody or Wheaton for the average, church-going, objectivist, Bible-believing Christian?
I think the danger is assuming that you have a kind of inerrant revelation from God that can be used in order to determine how life is to be lived and how the church is to be run. And, I mean, the problem with it is that it leads to all sorts of acts of injustice and oppression. I mean, just sort of the most obvious cases today are the way the Bible, being accepted as an objective revelation from God, requires that women not participate actively in churches and that gays not have civil rights. I think this is terrifically harmful, and it's all rooted in a false idea of what the Bible really is.
I mean, when I went to Fuller, it's interesting. I had a different experience than when you were at Moody or Wheaton, and so I guess probably Princeton was less shocking for me, because Fuller, it seemed to me, cut kind of a middle path. So I remember, I remember Richard Mao at the time was the provost, and I took a class with him, and we talked about the Fuller Statement of Faith, and I'd love to hear your reaction to this, because, of course, Fuller got in a lot of trouble in the 70s for hiring David Hubbard and declaring that they weren't going to have the word inerrancy in their statement of faith, but instead use this word infallibility of the text, of the Bible text. And so half the faculty left and moved to Chicago and, joined the faculty at Trinity, because that was an inerrantist seminary. Yeah. And when I asked Mao, what's the difference between inerrancy and infallibility, he said, inerrancy is about the kind of, and I'd like to hear you, because you use that word in your books, particularly in this most recent book. Inerrancy is about, is the Bible have any errors, even in, scientific or historical data? And when I write about stuff like that on my blog, conservatives get really up in arms, and they say I'm misunderstanding inerrancy, and that's not what inerrancy means at all. And then infallibility he described to me as, basically said, we kind of described it in the negative, and that is, when the Bible is read faithfully and in its historical context, it will not lead someone into sin. It won't lead you to do morally reprehensible things. But, there's a lot of... That's right.
And, when I was growing up as an evangelical back in the early 70s, my understanding of inerrancy was the one that you've given, is that the Bible makes no mistakes of any kind, historical, scientific, any kind, that it is without error. And so there's a literal creation, for example, and so forth. And the way I understood infallibility then, and that I've continued to understand infallibility, is I think a little bit stronger than the way you've expressed it. I've understood infallibility to mean that the Bible is a completely faithful representative of what to believe and how to behave. Not just that it won't lead somebody astray, but that in a positive way it speaks truth on all important issues of faith and doctrine.
Okay.
And so I think that's a little bit stronger than just saying it's not going to lead you astray.
Yeah. I remember. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, the problem with saying it's not going to lead you astray is that, of course, I mean, there are all sorts of things in the Bible that will lead you astray if you take them literally and you act upon them.
Right, and I think this was, in some ways it was probably reflective of Daniel Fuller, who was a professor at Fuller Seminary when I was there, who I think must have been the grandson of the founder, maybe the son of the founder, I don't know, but his big thing was the unity of the Bible, and that there's this overarching, yes, you can find things in the Old Testament that are reprehensible, but when subsumed by the entire biblical narrative. But again, this is all a question of hermeneutics. Ultimately.
Yes, absolutely. That's absolutely right. But even when you take the whole picture of the Bible, I mean, what kind of view of women emerges if you take the whole picture? You get minor exceptions like Junia the apostle or Phoebe the deacon, but basically the view of women is highly oppressive, and so I don't think that approach really solves all the problems.
Well, let me get your reaction to this. One of the more popular responses to that among progressive evangelicals is the thing that they call, and I can't remember the name of the guy who coined this phrase, but the trajectory hermeneutic, and that is, I was on a panel a couple years ago at the National Pastors Convention with Scott McKnight and Andy Crouch, and then there's a popular pastor named Rob Bell who has also referred to this, that when it comes to women and slaves, for instance, there's a trajectory in the Bible that is going from oppression to liberation, if you trace the Bible, right? And then this trajectory. So you know what I'm saying? Can you kind of see this?
We call that a hopeful hermeneutic.
Right. So there's this trajectory that goes from
Genesis. It's absolutely not true.
So they say this, but there's no similar trajectory when it comes to divorce or homosexuality. So that's how they can say. That's how they respond when someone like me, who supports same-sex marriage and says this can be a biblically virtuous lifestyle to live in monogamous same-sex relationship. Yes. They say, well, look, and when I come back and say, look, I'm not a literalist on women or on slaves, and I'm similarly not going to be a literalist on, the 6 verses in the entire corpus of Scripture that mention the word homosexuality. But then they pull out this trajectory hermeneutic.
Well, I think it's just a very convenient hermeneutic, because what it does is it allows you to have an easy conscience about issues that people agree on today, and allows you to maintain a conservative agenda whenever it suits your purposes. When in fact, if you look at if you actually trace the trajectory when it comes to women, it starts off badly and it ends badly. Among the last books of the Bible to be written are the pastoral epistles, and there's no place that's worse for women than the pastoral epistles. So I simply don't think that you can go with this trajectory approach.
I remember at Fuller taking New Testament. I took New Testament 1 and New Testament 2 from a guy named Bob Gulick, and I don't know that you ever crossed paths with him.
I know of his work, but I've never met him.
He was a close friend, and he was actually the reason I went to Fuller. And I remember in particular, it was a Monday-Wednesday class in New Testament 2, and he mentioned, he was starting to question Pauline authorship of Ephesians. There are some books that you use the word forgery. Other scholars might use the word pseudepigraphal writings or whatever, but
they use that word. They use that word when they're talking about the canon, but when they're talking about books not in the canon, they use the word forgery.
So when they're like when they're talking about the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Peter,
that could be a forgery, but
but right. It's pseudepigraphal otherwise.
That's a theological
amanuensis. But when Bob, I remember when Bob questioned the Pauline authorship of Ephesians. And it was one that he kind of left hanging. He said, it was kind of on the fence. It could go either way. But, it was very upsetting, not so much to me, but to some of my peers at Fuller who'd grown up in evangelical circles. And he would end the class and he'd say, look, I don't even want you to think about this between now and Wednesday, which was when the next class was. It was Monday, Wednesday class. And don't lose your faith between now and Wednesday. Come
right.
back. And we're going to talk about how you can still have faith in light of the idea that, in other words, whether the book of Ephesians should be canonical or is God's revelation to humankind in some sense, does not hinge on whether Paul was holding the pen and parchment to write it. That's not, but what's tricky, I guess, and I think what you probably raised in this book, particularly in Jesus Interrupted, and you've mentioned it in other books too, is that the canon, whether Ephesians made it in the canon or not, at the time the canon was being finally kind of closed up in the first several centuries after Jesus, did hinge on whether they thought Paul wrote it or not.
Well, that's absolutely true. I mean, historically, that's right. If the church fathers thought that it was forged, they would not have included it. Absolutely. We know this from the discussions they have about which books to include and to exclude. But that's a historical question, which is different from the faith question about whether this book can still be the Word of God or not. And the faith question has to be decided on some grounds other than purely historical, I think. I myself don't think any of the Bible is the Word of God in the strong sense. But it's because I'm not a believer. If
right.
I were a believer, though, I would probably be a more sophisticated believer than someone who said, well, Ephesians has to be by Paul because it's in the Bible. I mean, that's not persuasive logic to me.
Right, because it seems to me that it's an entirely different question to say, was God's Spirit directing the process by which the canon was determined, as opposed to saying, what were the merits by which one book was included and another book was excluded at the particular time. That's the historic question, but the question of faith is, regardless of how the process went down, do you believe as a Christian that God was involved in that process and somehow safeguarding which books should be in and which books shouldn't be in?
Yeah, well, that is definitely a different approach, and I think that there are different historical questions one can ask about the canon, and I think there are different theological questions one can ask about the canon. Theologically, if I were still a believer, I think I would ask whether there are books that are less authoritative than other books. Is 1 Timothy 2 less authoritative than passages that look upon women favorably? And I think I would certainly answer that question yes. But that would be a theological question, not a historical one.
Let me ask you a couple more quick questions before we have to go. One is the kind of second subtitle of your book. It's Jesus Interrupted, Revealing the Hidden Contradictions in the Bible, and then in parentheses, and why we don't know about them. And most of my listeners, as I told you before we started recording, the hidden contradictions in the Bible are no shock. I mean, I've written about them in a couple different books. Most of the people I hang out with are pretty theologically erudite and get that. That's not particularly shocking. But it sounds, and I know, I get how titles and subtitles of books are written. It sounds a little bit conspiracy theorish to say why we don't know about them. Like, what are you getting at as to why the average objectivist Christian doesn't know about the contradictions in the biblical text?
Yeah, it's interesting because I've had one or two other people say that it sounds kind of conspiratorial, that subtitle, and the first time somebody mentioned that to me, I was a little surprised because I don't think it's meant in a conspiratorial way. It's actually kind of a genuine question. Why is it that the person on the street or the person in the pew doesn't know about this when it's common knowledge among scholars? And I think that what I argue in the book is that there are two reasons people don't know. One is that scholars have done a horrible job at trying to communicate the results of their scholarship to normal human beings. Or at least it may be that they try, but they're very bad at it. because scholars just can't talk to normal human beings for some reason, and I don't know why. It's just the way it is. But the other bigger problem, of course, is the one that you're intimately familiar with, which is that this material is taught in seminaries and divinity schools to prospective pastors. At least in mainline churches. I mean, Presbyterian and Methodist and Lutheran and Episcopalian, et cetera, Catholic. In seminary, this is how Bible is taught. And yet when pastors then take churches and go into the ministry, they don't teach the Bible this way to their parishioners. Now, my view is that it's not appropriate for a pastor to spend time during a weekly sermon talking about all the contradictions between Mark and John or something like that. I don't think that's the appropriate venue. But there are adult education classes in churches, and it's very surprising to me that adults don't get educated. I think that, in fact, pastors could communicate this information to their parishioners, but for a variety of reasons they choose not to, and that's why all of this comes as news to people. It's because the place where they would be expected to hear this kind of information, they're not taught it at all. Where he shows that the historical critical method is what's taught in the Bible courses at seminary, but when the student then goes to a theology course, they have a completely different approach to the Bible and toward doing theology, so that the Bible professors don't have any idea what's really going on in the systematic theology courses, and the theologians don't know what's going on in the Bible courses, and nobody's integrating the two. And so it's no wonder that pastors come out not really sure how to approach things like this. It's because they're not trained to integrate the knowledge they've received. And so I'm not really just blaming pastors, although I think pastors could be doing more. As to what they should be doing, I think that, in fact, the historical critical method is theologically extremely fruitful if people would just think about it for a little while. And one of the major points in my book is that each author has to be read for what he has to say, whether it's a gospel or the Pauline epistles or the pseudo-Pauline epistles, and that there is a different theological message for each of these authors. So that when Mark is writing his account of Jesus' crucifixion, he has a very different view from Luke's view of Jesus' crucifixion. And what a pastor needs to do, not just in education but also in sermons, is to focus on the text at hand and see what that text is saying, rather than pretending that this text is saying something that all the other texts are also saying. So if one's preaching a sermon from Mark's account of the crucifixion, it has to be a very, very different kind of sermon from the sermon based on Luke's version of the crucifixion. So I think that if somebody accepts that this is somehow revelatory literature, the distinctiveness of all of these authors has to be taken very seriously, and so that the contradictions and discrepancies don't simply point out that, well, the Bible's not inerrant, and so you give up on it. It points out that each author has his own thing that he's trying to do.